The 37th floor of Denton Global's glass tower shimmered with the midday sun, the skyline of Manhattan spread like a crown behind the long mahogany table. Suits lined its edge, expensive watches glinting, pens clicking as the billionaire CEO Lyle Denton swaggered into the room. He thrived on spectacle, on the hush that fell whenever his Italian leather shoes struck the floor. Today was no different except for the faint squeak of a mop just beyond the polished conference table. Lila Johnson, the black janitor whose presence was usually invisible to the empire she kept clean, stood at the far end of the room. She moved with quiet rhythm, rinsing her mop in a metal bucket, pushing it across the marble tiles near the tall glass wall. The scent of lemon disinfectant drifted into the air, uninvited in a space perfumed by expensive cologne and power. Lyle Denton smirked as his eyes landed on her. "Well, look at this," he said, his voice rich with the smug confidence of a man who had never known hunger. "The most important meeting of the quarter, and apparently we needed live entertainment." He gestured broadly, as if presenting her to his board. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Mop Girl. Our diversity initiative at work." Laughter erupted, sharp and cold, bouncing off the glass walls. Some executives chuckled nervously, their loyalty tethered to Denton's approval. Others grinned without shame, tapping notes on tablets while sneaking glances at Lila as though she were the punchline of a corporate joke. One man raised his phone and pretended to film, making a mock documentary voiceover under his breath. Lila paused mid-swipe, the mop resting against the tiles. She didn't look up. Her shoulders remained steady, her breathing even. If the insult pierced her, she didn't show it. She dipped the mop back into the bucket, the water sloshing, and resumed. Denton's grin widened. He loved an audience. "Tell me, Lila," he said, pronouncing her name with exaggerated familiarity, "when you scrub these floors, do you ever dream of sitting at this table? Or is this your idea of a corner office?" A few staff members burst out laughing. One woman covered her mouth, but her eyes gleamed with cruel delight. The sound grew, rolling through the room like a wave meant to drown its target. But Lila didn't drown. She slowed her mop, raised it upright, and leaned it gently against the bucket. Then, for the first time, she looked up. Her gaze traveled along the table, meeting eyes without flinching. She didn't search for pity, nor did she offer defiance in the form of shouted words. Instead, she simply stood still, hands folded before her, the faint trace of something unreadable in her eyes. The laughter faltered. Not much, just a fraction of a second when a few realized she wasn't reacting as they expected. Denton noticed too, and to crush it, he leaned back in his chair, arms spread like a king on his throne. "You should be honored," he said, his tone dripping mock generosity. "Not everyone gets to be part of this room. You get to clean it. History in the making." Another ripple of laughter. Someone clapped sarcastically. Yet the sound did not break Lila. If anything, it seemed to polish her stillness until it shone sharper. She took a single step forward, her shoes squeaking faintly on the marble. The executives stilled, their curiosity pricked. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady, like the hum of a cello. "History is in this room," she said, each word deliberate, "but not the kind you think." The room quieted. Denton cocked his head, amused but unsettled by the sudden weight in her tone. He expected stammering or retreat, not a sentence that cut like a knife through his theatrics. Lila bent slightly, wrung out the mop, and placed it carefully into the bucket. She straightened, her eyes never leaving Denton's. "Go ahead," he pressed, his smirk twitching. "Tell us, what kind of history does a janitor see?" For the first time, Lila's lips curved just barely into a smile that wasn't amusement but something far older, more patient. She tilted her head, as though listening to a voice far away. Then she spoke, her words soft enough to force them all to lean in. "The kind of history," she said, "that outlives men like you." Silence, heavy, unexpected. The laughter evaporated, leaving only the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above. Denton blinked, his smirk cracking for a moment before he chuckled again, louder than before, trying to break the spell. But the echo of her words lingered in the air, heavier than any of them wanted to admit. At the far end of the table, an assistant who had joined the laughter seconds ago, now pressed her lips together, uneasy. A junior board member shifted uncomfortably, staring at Lila as if seeing her for the first time. Lila picked up the bucket, her arms steady, and moved toward the door. She paused only once, glancing back at the billionaire whose laughter suddenly sounded hollow, Her final words before leaving the boardroom hung like a storm cloud about to break. "You don't know my story yet, but you will." The door closed behind her, the click echoing through the stunned silence she left in her wake. Long before the skyscrapers and polished marble floors, before the sneers of billionaires and the applause of board members, Lila Johnson's life began in a narrow shotgun house on the east side of Atlanta. The walls were thin, patched with paint her grandmother had spread by hand. The furniture was mismatched, most of it rescued from curbsides or donated by neighbors. Yet within those walls, a different kind of wealth resided: stories, whispered in the dark, spoken over pots of collard greens, sung like hymns when the night was too heavy for silence. Her grandmother, Evelyn Johnson, was a woman whose back was bent from years of factory work but whose spirit towered higher than any skyline. Evelyn had marched in the late 1960s, her shoes blistered, her hands raw from holding signs demanding dignity. She carried scars, physical and invisible, from days when speaking truth could draw blood. Still, she survived. More than that, she lived with a defiant grace that carved itself into Lila's bones. "Child," Evelyn would say, rocking in her creaking wooden chair, "the world will laugh at you before it ever listens to you. But don't you shrink. You hold your ground. You remember where you came from, and you sing even if your voice shakes." Lila grew up with those words stitched into her soul. While other children memorized nursery rhymes, she memorized her grandmother's stories about bus boycotts, about women who worked 2 jobs and still found time to teach the younger ones how to read, about men who sang freedom songs under the weight of nightsticks. Evelyn never sugarcoated their pain, but she always ended with the same reminder: survival was more than breath, it was pride carried forward. By the time Lila turned 16, her grandmother's health began to fail. The once strong voice grew raspy, the steps slower. Lila took on shifts after school, cleaning diners, folding laundry for neighbors, babysitting toddlers while their mothers worked night shifts. Each dollar stretched to cover medicine, rent, and food. She learned quickly that invisibility was often survival. No one thanked the girl who scrubbed grease off plates, but she thanked herself by listening closely, by noticing. She absorbed the world the way her grandmother taught her, not just with her eyes, but with her spirit. On the nights Evelyn couldn't sleep, Lila would sit by her bed, holding her wrinkled hand as the elder hummed an old tune. It wasn't just a lullaby. It was a song carried from marches, a melody that had steadied trembling legs on long roads to justice. "You'll need this one day," Evelyn would whisper. "This song will remind you that you are never alone, even when they try to make you feel that way." When Evelyn finally passed, Lila was 19. The world felt unbearably quiet without that voice guiding her, but the silence soon revealed what her grandmother had left behind. Inside an old biscuit tin, Lila discovered letters, hundreds of them written in Evelyn's slanted script. Letters to family, to fellow marchers, to herself. They told of humiliations endured, victories won, and unshakable hope for the next generation. Lila read them like scripture, each word burned into her memory, transforming her grief into something sturdier. She realized then that her life would never be about applause or recognition. Her power, like Evelyn's, would be rooted in the stories she carried, silent but indestructible. Years blurred into the present. Cleaning became her trade, not out of choice but necessity. She worked in offices where no one looked at her twice, where her presence was as unremarkable as the hum of the air conditioning. Yet, while she bent to polish their floors, she listened. She listened to careless jokes, to backroom deals, to the arrogance of those who mistook wealth for worth. And in every insult, every dismissal, every laugh that brushed her aside, she heard echoes of her grandmother's warning: "The world will laugh before it listens." Still, she held her ground. She carried the mop like a staff, a silent witness to both cruelty and potential. Invisible labor became her camouflage, but it never dimmed the light she carried. She didn't need their recognition. She had her grandmother's letters, her grandmother's song. And then came the day of the boardroom humiliation. That evening, after Denton's laughter had subsided and the room emptied, Lila lingered near her cart in the dim hallway. Her hands trembled slightly, not from shame but from the effort it took to contain what surged inside her. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, she began to hum her grandmother's song. The melody rose soft but steady, weaving through the silence like smoke from a hidden fire. What she didn't realize was that she wasn't alone. At the far end of the corridor, a secretary had paused to gather papers she had dropped. She froze at the sound, her chest tightening at the mournful, resilient cadence of the tune. She didn't know the words, but she felt them. They wrapped around her heart, carrying a weight of centuries in their rise and fall. The secretary straightened slowly, papers forgotten in her hands, listening as if afraid to breathe too loudly. For the first time, she saw the janitor not as background, not as part of the furniture of the office, but as something far larger. The song felt like a truth that didn't require translation, like a key unlocking something she didn't even know was locked inside her. Lila finished the melody and exhaled, unaware of the witness. She gathered her cart, pushed it down the hall, and disappeared into the elevator. But the song lingered in the air, clinging to the secretary's ears long after the doors closed. The first seed had been planted. It was subtle, almost invisible, like the first crack in marble that eventually splits the whole statue. But it was there. The memory of that song, that quiet power, would ripple through the building in ways no one yet understood. Denton had tried to humiliate her into silence, but instead, he had unwittingly drawn her voice out into the open. And history, the kind that outlives men like him, had just begun to stir. The cafeteria of Denton Global was usually a noisy place at noon, buzzing with chatter about quarterly numbers, vacation plans, and the subtle jockeying of corporate ambition. But that afternoon, the air seemed different, heavier somehow, as if a quiet current moved beneath the clatter of trays and the hiss of espresso machines. At a small corner table sat Jalen, a 19-year-old intern who still carried the nervous energy of someone terrified of missteps. He had been in the boardroom 2 days earlier, when Denton humiliated Lila. Like most, he had laughed not from cruelty, but from fear of being the only one who didn't, yet the laughter had sat bitter on his tongue ever since. Worse, he hadn't been able to shake the words Lila left behind. "You don't know my story yet, but you will." Now, as he carried his tray across the cafeteria, he noticed her. Lila, in her plain navy uniform, was seated alone at a corner table, eating a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Her posture was straight, not slouched, her eyes focused somewhere distant, as though she were listening to music no one else could hear. Jalen hesitated, then walked over, his palms damp. Miss Johnson?" he asked softly. "Can I sit here?" Lila looked up, her gaze steady but not unkind. She nodded once, motioning to the chair across from her. Jalen sat, awkwardly adjusting his tie, then blurted the words that had been burning his tongue. "That song you were humming in the hall. What was it?" For a moment, she didn't respond. She took another bite of her sandwich, chewed slowly, swallowed. Then her voice came, calm as ever. "It's a song my grandmother used to sing. She marched in Selma with it on her lips. She told me the words gave courage when legs grew heavy." Jalen leaned forward, entranced. "What does it mean?" "It means," Lila said, her eyes softening, "that dignity cannot be mopped away. It means that even when the world calls you invisible, your story matters." The cafeteria noise seemed to dim around them. Other staff glanced over, curious at the unlikely pairing. The janitor and the intern, two figures usually dismissed, suddenly looked like the center of gravity in the room. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, whispers threaded through the cubicles and meeting rooms. The janitor's grandmother was a marcher. The janitor has stories. What had been ridicule began to shift into curiosity. One afternoon, during a routine board meeting, a young board member named Elise Harper raised her hand unexpectedly. She was known for her sharp tongue, but also for a conscience that had quietly bristled under Denton's arrogance for years. "Mr. Denton," she said, cutting into the meeting, "before we continue, I'd like to ask Lila something." The CEO blinked, thrown off. "The janitor? Really?" "Yes," Elise said firmly, her eyes turning to where Lila was tidying the corner as usual. "Lila, that song you sang in the hallway, could you share its story with us?" The boardroom, once full of the confident rhythm of executives, fell into pin-drop silence. Lila froze, mop in hand, the request echoing against the memory of their laughter. She saw Denton's smirk daring her to speak and risk further humiliation. But something had shifted inside her. The whispers, the intern's earnest eyes, the secretary's silence as she listened all had reminded her of Evelyn's words, "Don't shrink." Lila straightened, leaving the mop against the wall. She walked toward the table, her steps unhurried, her voice steady when it came. "It's not just a song," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "It's a memory. My grandmother sang it when her feet blistered on marches. My mother hummed it while scrubbing laundry at night, and I hum it here, not because I am small, but because I carry them with me. Every note is survival. Every verse is a promise. The air thickened. For the first time, Denton did not interrupt with laughter. His smirk wavered, though he leaned back in his chair, trying to look unaffected. But the board members leaned forward, assistants paused in the doorway. People listened. Lila's voice deepened. You laughed at me because I hold a mop, but this mop has fed families, this uniform has kept roofs over heads, and while you see labor, I see legacy. The story you mocked is the story that built the very ground under your feet. A murmur rippled through the room. One executive shifted uncomfortably, another looked down at her notes. The power balance had begun to tilt, ever so slightly. Denton cleared his throat, his voice louder than it needed to be. Touching, he said sarcastically. But this is a board meeting, not a church sermon. Yet the interruption sounded brittle. Weak. For the first time, his words didn't land with authority. Lila met his gaze without blinking. You wanted entertainment, Mr. Denton. Now you have truth. The silence that followed was electric, a silence no laughter could fill. And then, with deliberate care, she reached into her bag and placed a folder on the polished table. The paper was worn, edges frayed. These, she said, her hand resting on the folder, are letters. Letters my grandmother wrote, preserved through decades. Words about dignity, equality, and what it means to stand tall even when bent low. If you laughed at my mop, let's see if you can laugh at her truth. Gasps and whispers filled the air. Denton's jaw tightened. For the first time, he felt the grip of something slipping through his fingers. The first evidence of her power was about to be revealed. The folder sat on the mahogany table like an uninvited guest, its edges worn, its surface faintly smudged by years of being handled. A corporate boardroom was used to glossy reports bound in leather, charts projected in sleek digital graphs, and contracts stamped with weighty signatures. But this was something altogether different. No one moved at first. Even the hum of the city beyond the glass windows seemed to dim as eyes flicked from the folder to the woman who had placed it there. Lila Johnson, janitor, stood with her palms resting lightly on the cover, as if guarding not paper but a living heartbeat. Denton forced a laugh. What's this? Homework? Are we supposed to believe some old scraps of paper matter in this room? His voice carried its usual arrogance, but it cracked at the edges. He hadn't expected her to have anything more than a story, much less something tangible. Lila didn't look at him. Instead, she opened the folder slowly, reverently. Inside lay a stack of yellowed letters, some written on lined notebook pages, others on envelopes that had been carefully unfolded and preserved. She pulled out the first one, her hands steady, and began to read aloud. My dearest Lila, she recited, her voice strong but warm, if you are reading this one day, know that you come from people who refuse to bow. We were bent, we were bloodied, but never broken. When the world laughs at you, remember it laughed at us too, and we sang louder. A hush fell across the boardroom. The executives leaned in despite themselves. The cadence of the words cut through years of cynicism, reaching places quarterly reports never touched. Lila continued, this letter was written in 1965, the day my grandmother marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. She wrote about tear gas burning her lungs, about men on horseback swinging clubs, about falling to her knees and rising again because dignity demanded it. She wrote that even when her body trembled, the song in her chest kept her walking. An audible gasp broke from one of the assistants. Another board member shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his tie as though it had grown too tight. Denton scoffed, louder this time, sentimental nonsense. Letters from half a century ago don't change balance sheets. This is a waste of our time. But his words rang hollow, his voice lacked conviction, and everyone in the room knew it. Lila turned the page, ignoring him. She read a passage about neighbors pooling their meager savings to send one child to college, about women sewing clothes late into the night so their children could walk into classrooms with dignity. She spoke of hunger that was shared and of laughter that survived in spite of it. As her voice filled the room, the atmosphere shifted. Some who had laughed at her 2 days earlier now found themselves staring at the table, unable to meet her eyes. Others blinked rapidly, fighting tears. A secretary in the corner pressed a hand against her chest, remembering the song she had heard in the hallway. The truth was undeniable. The woman they had mocked carried with her a history deeper and richer than anything their resumes could boast. She wasn't a background character in their story, they were background to hers. Do you know what my grandmother wrote on her last page? Lila asked quietly, lifting her gaze to the room. She wrote, "If they silence me, then you must speak. If they laugh at you, then you must stand taller. If they deny you, then you must endure until they cannot deny you any longer." A silence so complete followed that even the ticking of the wall clock seemed deafening. Denton tried to seize it back. "This is a boardroom," he snapped, his voice sharp. "We deal in profits, not poetry." But as he spoke, one of the board members, Elise Harper, interrupted him. "With respect, Mr. Denton," she said firmly, "what we just heard is more leadership than anything I've seen in this room in years." The words landed like a thunderclap. Heads turned, eyes widened. For the first time in his career, Denton's authority was openly challenged in front of his own board. He shifted uncomfortably, his face reddening, his jaw tightening. "Don't be ridiculous. We can't let a janitor dictate company policy." "No," Elise said evenly. "But maybe we should let her remind us what humanity looks like." The murmurs began then, soft, uncertain at first, but growing. Executives who had smirked during Denton's jokes now exchanged glances, their expressions troubled. Assistants whispered at the edges of the room. The tide was turning, slow but unmistakable. Lila closed the folder and rested her hands on it once more. "These are not just letters," she said. "They are evidence. Proof that when arrogance tries to erase dignity, dignity writes itself down so it cannot be forgotten. You asked for entertainment. I gave you truth. But this," she tapped the folder gently, "is only the beginning." She stepped back, her voice low but charged. "If you think these words silenced you, wait until you hear what else has been hidden." The room stilled, a collective intake of breath hanging in the air. Denton opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The smirk that had once commanded a room now looked like a mask slipping in the heat of fire, and then Lila turned, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. "I promise you," she said, her voice like thunder wrapped in velvet, "there is a bigger truth yet to come." The cliffhanger hung in the air like the first crack of lightning before a storm. The following week, the boardroom felt different before anyone even entered it. The air carried a tension that no fresh flowers or polished mahogany could disguise. Denton Global's executives filed in with careful expressions, some with nervous glances at the tall windows, others adjusting ties or scrolling aimlessly on their tablets. They knew today's meeting would not be like the others. Word had spread too far, too quickly. At the head of the table sat Lyle Denton, his jaw tight, his hands tapping a slow rhythm against the armrest of his chair. He had tried to drown out the whispers, tried to insist that what happened the week before was nothing more than a distraction. But the silence he'd been met with the lingering stares, the murmurs in hallways gnawed at him. He knew control was slipping, and nothing infuriated him more. Then, the doors opened. Lila Johnson entered, not with her mop and bucket this time, but with a folder tucked under one arm and a simple dark dress that seemed to transform her from invisible laborer into something undeniably present. She didn't rush, didn't apologize for her entrance. She simply walked to the end of the table and stood. Several board members rose slightly, as though instinctively acknowledging her. A few assistants paused mid-note-taking, their pens hovering in the air. Denton shifted in his seat, his face tightening. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice edged with impatience. "We're not here for story hour." But Elise Harper, the young board member who had first asked Lila to speak, interjected, "Actually, Mr. Denton, we invited her. We felt her perspective deserved to be heard officially." A murmur rippled through the room. Denton's eyes darted across the table, realizing too many of them were nodding. The balance was no longer his alone to hold. Lila placed her folder on the table, her voice steady when she spoke. "Last time, I showed you my grandmother's letters. Today, I want to show you something I've been building quietly, after hours, when this building was empty except for me." She pulled out several sheets of paper, then a USB drive. "This is a proposal for a cultural literacy and mentorship program. I drafted it on my breaks. It's designed to bring underrepresented youth into spaces like this, not as janitors, but as leaders. It combines scholarships, mentorship, and community workshops. I've spent years listening in this building. I know what's missing here. This is how you fix it." The screen at the end of the room flickered to life as she connected the drive. A presentation appeared, simple but elegant graphs, plans, testimonies she had quietly collected from young people in her community. Her voice carried with it the cadence of someone who wasn't performing but speaking from truth. At first, The executives sat stiff, unprepared for what they were seeing. But slowly, as the slides progressed, heads began to nod. One man leaned forward, jotting notes with unusual intensity. Another woman whispered, "This could actually work." Denton tried to laugh it off. "This is absurd. A janitor thinks she can redesign company policy? This is charity work, not business." But his voice faltered. No one laughed with him this time. Lila turned to him, her eyes unwavering. "You laughed at me when I cleaned your floors. You mocked me as entertainment. But what you called charity, I call leadership. And what you call absurd, I call the future." The words landed like a gavel. The room erupted, not in laughter, but in applause. It began with Elise, sharp and deliberate, then spread across the table until even those who had once mocked Lila were clapping. A few assistants stood, their hands striking together with the force of recognition. Denton's face flushed crimson. He slammed his hand against the table. "Enough, this is my company, my boardroom." But his words only highlighted his isolation. The applause grew louder, swallowing his protest. For the first time, Lyle Denton's power fractured in full view of those who had once feared him. Lila raised her hand, and the applause softened into silence. Her voice, low but resolute, filled the room. "Understand this. I didn't come here for revenge. Revenge is small, fleeting. What I came here for is change, and this," she tapped the proposal on the table, "this is only the beginning." Her eyes swept the room, meeting each gaze in turn, lingering longest on Denton. "You thought you could humiliate me into silence. Instead, you handed me a microphone, and I promise you, I will not put it down. The sever with, it's prisonentures, and kit the survively. It's prisonanty." The weight of her words pressed against the glass walls, against the city sprawling outside. For the first time in its history, the boardroom didn't belong to the billionaire at the head of the table. It belonged to the janitor, who refused to bow. Denton sat frozen, his fists clenched, his mouth open but empty of words. He looked around for allies, but found only eyes that refused to meet his. His laughter had once filled this space like an anthem. Now it sounded, in memory, like a bad joke no one wanted to claim. And at the center of it all stood Lila, not triumphant in the shallow sense of victory, but unshakable, her presence rewriting the rules of the room. For the first time, power had shifted. The echoes of applause in the boardroom did not fade easily. They carried down the elevators, into hushed conversations in cubicles, and out into the city through whispers that could not be contained. Something had shifted at Denton Global. What was once a fortress of arrogance had become the birthplace of an awakening. And at its center stood Lila Johnson, the janitor whose story had cracked the marble floors of power. But Lila did not mistake the applause for an ending. Applause fades. What lasts is what you build after the noise dies down. In the weeks that followed, she worked quietly with Elise Harper and a small coalition of board members who believed in her vision. They pored over her cultural literacy proposal, refining details, allocating budgets, designing the structure for mentorship programs. For the first time, the company was not just talking about diversity as a glossy line in annual reports, it was investing in it. Word of the initiative spread beyond the tower. Local schools began reaching out, asking if their students could apply. Community centers offered to host workshops. Teachers wrote letters, thanking the company for opening doors that had long been nailed shut. Lila stood at the front of the first pilot workshop, facing a group of high school students seated in folding chairs. Some slouched with skepticism, others leaned forward with curiosity. They were kids who had been told too many times what they couldn't be. She began not with a lecture, but with the same story her grandmother had told her. About walking across bridges even when police dogs snapped at your heels. About singing when your lungs burned with tear gas. About remembering that dignity is not given by men in suits, but carried by those who refuse to let it die. When she finished, silence hung heavy. Then a girl in the back raised her hand. "Miss Johnson, how do you not hate them, the people who laughed at you?" Lila paused. She thought of Denton's smirk, the way his laughter had cut through the boardroom like a whip. The easy answer would have been to say she did hate him. But hate, she had learned, was a small room with no windows. "I don't waste my breath on hate," she said softly. "Revenge destroys, justice builds. And I am here to build something that will outlast their laughter." The girl's eyes glistened. Around her, heads nodded. Something flickered alive in the room, hope, fragile but undeniable. Back at Denton Global, the changes were visible. The janitor's cart no longer rolled unnoticed through the hallways. Employees greeted Lila with respect, some even stopping to thank her. A scholarship fund was established in her grandmother's name, the Evelyn Johnson Legacy Fund. The first recipients, 5 students from underserved communities, received full college tuition. Their acceptance letters were read aloud at a company gathering, drawing cheers and tears in equal measure. And what of Lyle Denton? The man who once laughed the loudest now found himself on the edges of his own empire. Investors began questioning his leadership, whispering about arrogance that blinded him to vision. News outlets picked up the story of the janitor who had transformed a corporation, painting her as a symbol of resilience while Denton became a footnote of ridicule. His speeches at conferences drew sparse applause. His interviews were overshadowed by questions about the very woman he had tried to humiliate. One evening, Denton stood in his penthouse, staring at the skyline that once felt like his domain. The city lights stretched endlessly, but for the first time, they didn't reflect victory. They reflected irrelevance. His name, once synonymous with success, was now a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the country. Meanwhile, Lila walked home from the community center under the glow of street lamps, her bag filled with handwritten thank you notes from students. She paused on the corner where the subway rumbled beneath her feet, listening to the hum of the city. She thought of Evelyn, of collard greens simmering on the stove, of songs hummed in the dark. She smiled, not because she had conquered Denton, but because she had honored her grandmother's legacy. She had taken humiliation and turned it into architecture, something future generations could live inside. Weeks later, at a press conference, Lila stood behind a podium with the company's new initiative banner stretched above her. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned in. Beside her stood students who had received scholarships, teachers who had partnered with the program, and even executives who had once mocked her but now stood humbled by her strength. "This is not about me," Lila told the crowd. "This is about the voices that were silenced but never destroyed. This is about showing our children that their stories are not burdens, they are blueprints. Revenge may topple a man, but justice builds a world, and we are here to build." Applause thundered. Reporters scribbled. Somewhere in the back, a child clutched a scholarship certificate to his chest like it was the key to a future he had once been told was impossible. And so, the janitor who had once been invisible became something more than visible. She became a beacon. The billionaire who mocked her had faded into the margins, his laughter remembered only as the spark that ignited a movement. And in its place rose a new legacy, not of arrogance, but of justice, of dignity, of hope. Lila left the stage that day to a standing ovation. She didn't bask in it. She simply hummed her grandmother's song under her breath, each note carrying forward the truth Evelyn had always known. The world will laugh before it listens, but if you keep singing, one day it cannot help but hear. That song, once whispered in kitchens and marches, now echoed in classrooms, boardrooms, and community halls. It was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, mocked, or overlooked, and who now understood that silence could become strength. And with that, the mop had become a movement. 2 years later, the 37th floor of Denton Global looked nothing like the fortress of arrogance it once was. The mahogany table was the same, the glass windows still caught the Manhattan skyline, but the atmosphere had changed. Where laughter once mocked, now quiet respect lingered. Where voices once dismissed, now new voices rose. On that spring morning, the company gathered not for quarterly projections, but for a celebration. Banners stretched across the walls. The Evelyn Johnson Legacy Fund, 2 years strong. 100 students filled the room, their faces glowing with anticipation, their futures crackling with possibility. Teachers, parents, and mentors filled every seat, some standing along the walls, leaning forward to catch every word. At the front stood Lila Johnson. No longer in a janitor's uniform, she wore a deep blue dress, simple but dignified, her posture straight, her presence commanding. She had not chased power, but it had found her, and now, she carried it not for herself, but for those who followed. She looked out at the crowd and began. 2 years ago, I stood in this very room and was laughed at. I was told my place was at the margins, holding a mop. But I carried with me something stronger than mockery, my grandmother's story. And today, because of her story, because of your stories, we are here to celebrate over 200 scholarships granted, 20 mentorship programs launched, and countless young people who now walk into doors that once slammed shut. Applause thundered. Students wiped tears from their eyes. Cameras flashed, capturing a moment no one could deny. In the back of the room, unnoticed by most, sat Lyle Denton. His tailored suit seemed looser now, his posture slouched. He had been removed as CEO a year earlier, replaced by a leadership team that embraced the changes he once mocked. His wealth remained, but his relevance had withered. He was a ghost in a room he once ruled. He listened as applause rang out, his smirk long gone, replaced by a hollow stare. Lila saw him. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. But instead of bitterness, her gaze carried something else, pity, perhaps, or quiet acknowledgement. She did not need to defeat him further. Time had already done the work. His laughter was a relic. Her voice was the present, and the future. She turned back to the podium. I want to end not with my words, but with my grandmother's. She unfolded a letter, yellowed at the edges but preserved carefully. Her voice softened, filled with reverence as she read. One day, child, you will be asked to stand in places they say you don't belong. Do not shrink. Sing your song. Because your song is older than their laughter, stronger than their walls, and truer than their power. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter. Then she began to hum. The same song Evelyn had hummed decades ago. The same melody that once floated down a hallway after humiliation. The same tune that had seeded transformation in silence. The students rose, one by one, joining her. Their voices some shaky, some strong layered together until the entire room swelled with the sound. Parents joined, teachers added harmony, executives closed their eyes and let the melody wash over them. The song that once belonged to one family now belonged to all. Even the city beyond the windows seemed to pause, the honking horns and distant sirens fading beneath the resonance of voices joined in unison. When the final note fell into silence, there were no dry eyes. The applause that followed shook the walls. Lila lifted her hand, waiting for quiet. This, she said, her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes, is the legacy of a janitor's song. It is not mine alone, it is yours. It is every voice that refuses to be silenced, every story that refuses to be erased. We have built something together, not revenge, but justice. Not noise, but music. She stepped back from the podium, her smile small but certain. Around her, the students held their certificates high. Parents clutched each other's hands. Executives stood taller, some remembering how small they had once made her feel. And in the back, Denton slipped out quietly, swallowed by the anonymity of a city that no longer cared for his name. His downfall was not dramatic, it was worse. It was forgetfulness. But Lila's legacy? That was unforgettable. Months later, murals appeared across neighborhoods, paintings of a woman holding a mop in one hand and a book in the other, children gathered at her feet. Her story traveled to conferences, schools, podcasts, even the news. She became not a celebrity, but a symbol, a reminder that dignity can grow from the most invisible corners, that justice can rise from the quietest songs. And late at night, when the noise of the city dimmed, Lila would sit by her window and hum the tune once more, her grandmother's song still steady in her chest. She would think of the faces of the students, the tears of their parents, the applause that meant more than numbers on a balance sheet ever could. The world had once laughed at her. Now, it listened. And as the screen of this story fades, her voice carries one final time, reaching not just those in the room, but those beyond the story, those watching, listening, remembering. Your story matters. Sing it, even if your voice shakes. And if this touched you, share it, comment, subscribe. Let us keep building together. The camera lingers on her face, her eyes bright with unshakable resolve. Then the screen fades to black, carrying the final words in bold white letters.